Hello everyone. Welcome from the ridge in the White Mountains of New Hampshire that sits just above our farmhouse in the valley below. It's a grand vista, and it includes, although you can't see it yet, Mount Washington in the distance, which has significance for international relations because it's where the principal post-war economic agreements were reached at Bretton Woods. Today, however, I think I'll spend most of it chasing away these gnats, which are coming at me in large numbers. I'm unable to deter them, and deterrence is the subject of my talk. Did you hear that, gnats? Go away. Deterrence is both a theory and a strategy of conflict management. It attempts through threats and military buildups to dissuade a would-be adversary or an adversary from carrying out an action you don't want it to take. Thus, throughout the Cold War, Americans believed that NATO armed forces and their nuclear arsenal deterred the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe. As this example indicates, it can be very difficult to know whether deterrence succeeds or not. The fact that the Soviet Union didn't invade Western Europe might have been because of deterrence, or it may have been because the Soviet Union never had any intention to invade Western Europe. We now know, with access, for a while at least, to Soviet archives, that that latter explanation was the correct one. Deterrence has a sister strategy called compellence. The only difference is that compellence tries to get someone to carry out an action that they otherwise wouldn't do. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Americans attempted to compel the Soviets to remove their missiles from the island of Cuba. Now, deterrence has been around from time immemorial. In his account of the Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides offers an implicit critique of it. It became more central in the Cold War because of the advent of nuclear weapons. Nobody wanted to fight a war. If deterrence could prevent it and nuclear weapons became central to deterrence, that was a far more preferable state of affairs. And indeed, the Americans thought, at least for the first 10-12 years of the Cold War, that this would work very well because they increasingly had the capability to destroy the Soviet Union from bombers and weapons in Europe and later from missiles, while the Soviet Union did not have this capability until it did in the short term when it put missiles into Cuba, which is of course one of the key reasons why the Americans wanted to get them out. Once the Soviets developed the capability of destroying the United States, which they did late 60s, early 70s, at least seriously damaging the United States, nuclear deterrence in the eyes of strategists became more problematic because it became difficult to credibly threaten to use nuclear weapons if it meant mutual suicide. Deterrence theorists reasoned that to succeed, deterrence had to meet 4 conditions. The action that was impermissible had to be very clearly defined. You had to draw a red line someplace, and you had to communicate it effectively to the adversary in question. Number 3, you had to have the capability to either protect that commitment or in some other way punish the adversary if it nevertheless challenged you by crossing that red line, and you had to make your threat credible in the eyes of the adversary. I developed an interest in this and spent 10 years writing a book called Between Peace and War, The Nature of International Crisis, largely because I had lived through in university the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, both of which raised the prospect of the Cold War becoming hot. I'm going to interrupt at this point because the gnats are getting to be something fierce. Hello again, and very sorry for the interruption. It turns out this is the one week when all the gnats are out, and I didn't quite realize what it would be like if we continue with our concept of deterrence and apply it to the situation. We could say that deterrence failed because the gnats failed to notify me of their commitment to keep me from giving the lecture on the ridge. On the other hand, they certainly succeeded in compelling me to withdraw. It's odd too, because hiking on that trail, as Carol and I do much of the year when we're here, there are all kinds of animals you see, but we've never encountered an insect infestation like that. Well, deterrence, I have explained to you, requires these 4 conditions for it to function, according to deterrence theorists. What the theorists don't talk about, but in fact what deterrence really depends on, are a number of other assumptions, most of which are questionable. And in the course of my talk, I'm going to focus on them. My talk will be a little different from my usual one, because rather than giving a kind of synoptic overview of the problem, I'm going to do so by focusing on my own research. On the subject of deterrence, it began in 1969, the year I received my tenure, or 1970, at City College in New York, and therefore had time to invest in a lengthy research project without having the clock ticking. So it was 10 years before the book was published, Between Peace and War, The Nature of International Crisis, that was the book that initially made my reputation, and in part because of the conceptual and empirical critique of deterrence that I developed. That book was recently reissued in 2021, a 40th anniversary edition, with 3 new chapters appeared. The critique is as valid as ever. Evidence that's come to light since the end of the Cold War has confirmed, in my mind certainly, that my interpretations were correct, and that therefore my critique of deterrence is valid. I'll discuss that work and follow on work that I did with Janice Stein, and leave you with the understanding that deterrence continues to be robust in the minds of policymakers around the world, in large part because they desperately want to believe in it. And the same is true with scholars, but I'll leave that for the conclusion. When I began my study, as I noted, it was in the shadow of the Berlin and Cuban Missile Crises. The world came close to catastrophe. We now know it came much closer to catastrophe than we ever thought was the case at the time, but more about that later or in another lecture. I was convinced that war avoidance had to focus on crisis management and prevention. I also believed that it was somewhat foolhardy to limit myself to Soviet-American crises, in large part because we only had evidence from one side, and indeed only partial evidence from the United States. We had nothing but more or less propagandistic announcements from the Soviet side, so not very helpful for doing an empirical analysis of a conflict where it is absolutely essential to understand how the conflict arose and how the two sides interacted through the eyes of the leaders of the two sides, because it's an interactive process. One of the problems with existing analyses at the time, and alas, this still continues in some ways, was to project our ideological understandings on the other side and interpret their behavior accordingly, which of course is one of the reasons we concluded that deterrence was a success in the Berlin crisis, that otherwise Stalin would have invaded Berlin in 1949 or Khrushchev in 1961. You can't make these kinds of assumptions because it makes a strategy and a theory self-fulfilling in a tautological way. What I did in Between Peace and War was to analyze 16 international crises from 1898 to 1967, which was the Arab-Israeli War. In most cases, I was able to get evidence from both sides, and so to reconstruct the crisis, its run-up and its aftermath from the perspectives of the leaders of adversarial participants. This, of course, was not possible once we entered the post-war era. Now, of course, it is, but only in many years later. When I began the project, I was not critical of deterrence. I had swallowed hook, line, and sinker, as the expression goes, the early accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis written by Elie Abel, a journalist, a very able journalist, and the personal accounts of Arthur Schlesinger and Ted Sorensen, both of whom had been members of the Kennedy administration. They made it appear that Kennedy had tried deterrence. It had failed because he hadn't practiced it strongly enough, but that compellence had forced Khrushchev to back down and to withdraw his missiles. In the words of Secretary of State Dean Rusk, we were eyeball to eyeball, and the other side blinked. I was struck, therefore, when I conducted my case studies and gathered data, that deterrence had failed on a number of occasions, 1914 being a case in point, but the four conditions of deterrence appeared to be met. The state in question had defined its commitment. It had communicated it often, carefully and repeatedly to would-be adversaries. It had the means to defend it, and it did its best to impart credibility to this commitment. But deterrence still had failed. In the crises of what I call brinkmanship, that was a subset of my total sample. These were crises in which an adversary challenged a commitment of another adversary in the expectation or hope that it would back down. In most of these crises, the adversary did not back down, and the initiator was compelled to, or the initiator's challenge provoked a war. So there was no evidence that deterrence had worked. struck me as highly anomalous. I kept looking for ways of squaring my evidence with the theory. Then one day, of all places on the handball court, I had this epiphany. Maybe there was nothing wrong with my findings, but something wrong with the theory and strategy of deterrence. So I went back to my data and I became convinced that this was the case. I then reframed the central question of my inquiry, which was, why did deterrence fail? Because it did in at least 8 of my cases where the 4 conditions of deterrence had been satisfied. In 6 of them it led to war. And here I made use of both motivational and cognitive psychology to develop explanations of what had happened. And my argument in nutshell form goes something like this, that there are 2 generic kinds of challenges, those motivated by opportunity and those motivated by need. In opportunity challenges, they're carried out because the initiator thinks it can get away with it, the other side will back down. If it does, fine, the initiator makes a gain. As Hitler did against France and Britain in the Rhineland and in the Czechoslovakian crisis that led to the Munich Agreement, where Britain and France basically sold Czechoslovakia down the drain. If, on the other hand, the defender remains firm, then the initiator can say, well, I've miscalculated, and look for a graceful way out. When an initiator is motivated by need, it's a more difficult situation. What do I mean by need? I found in a number of my crises that the challenges that were made were motivated by a combination of domestic and foreign problems which leaders believed could only be overcome through a successful challenge of an adversary's commitment. Let's take Nikita Khrushchev and the deployment of missiles in Cuba. The first generation Soviet ICBM tended to explode on the launching pad. It was more dangerous to the Soviets than to the US. At the same time, the US felt threatened by Soviet strategic developments, but understood that it had a first strike capability because satellites had shown the inadequacy of the first generation Soviet ICBM and had also allowed the US to identify and pinpoint all the airfields and other targets against which it could send bombers or missiles. In an attempt to moderate Khrushchev, Kennedy made it clear to the Soviets the true strategic situation and suggested that there were circumstances in which he would use his weapons against the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev felt very much in the need of a quick strategic fix. The Soviets had also made a major investment in supporting Castro. It appeared that the Americans were preparing for an invasion of that island to overthrow Castro. They had tried in 1962 to do that in a smaller invasion of Cuban refugees. That invasion had failed, and now the military was preparing massively to do it and get it right. In fact, Kennedy had no intention of invading Cuba, but these military plans were an effort to put pressure on Cuba in the hope of deterring Khrushchev and having him act with more restraint. Khrushchev and Castro were convinced that Kennedy was out to actually use force and get rid of Castro, reinforced as well by at least 6 unsuccessful attempts made by the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro. So foreign policy motives were compelling, and so I argue were domestic motives, where for a complicated set of political reasons, Khrushchev very much hoped for a victory to buy him space to deal with hardliners at home. Anger also entered into the picture. Khrushchev dreamed up the missile deployment while on the beach on holiday in Varna, Bulgaria. He and Marshal Malinovsky were sitting in beach chairs. Khrushchev noted that across the Black Sea, the Americans were deploying Jupiter missiles targeted on the Soviet Union. He became angrier and angrier, turned to Malinovsky and said, "What if I put missiles in Cuba to get even with him?" So anger, domestic politics, strategic needs, and protecting Cuba all combined in Khrushchev's mind to convince him he had to act and to do something, secret deployment of missiles in Cuba, which most of his principal advisors told him was an impractical venture, that the Americans would discover the missiles, that they would see it as a serious provocation, that it might actually provoke rather than deter the invasion of Cuba. Once we become committed to do something because we believe we need to, we become, and here I'm drawing on Irving Janis and Leon Mann's motivated model of conflict decision-making. Once we become convinced we need to do something, we become correspondingly insensitive, or many of us do, to information that suggests we're heading toward disaster. We ignore it, we discredit it, we explain it away, we may punish the people who tell it to us, we may even rig the feedback networks of intelligence and military intelligence, as for example the Bush administration did prior to their invasion of Iraq, to only provide them information supportive of their initiatives. Thus, Kennedy's efforts to deter Khrushchev failed, and they didn't fail because Kennedy didn't practice deterrence firmly enough. He did. They failed because Khrushchev did not